How can I be free of conditioning? A friend recently asked this question, which is very pertinent for many. So let's inquire into it. What is conditioning? Conditioning is simply the various thought patterns that keep on recurring, that are stored in our memory. We accumulate so many thought patterns, both through genetic and environmental influences, nature and nurture. And it comes in various forms, both at a individual level in terms of specific likes, dislikes, and then collective level in terms of culture, religion, politics, nation, all of it. So all of these memory patterns that are stored and that keep on recurring is what is conditioning. And when we look at conditioning, we also can see that conditioning itself is not a problem. The problem is false identification with conditioning. Because even simple things like the language we speak, how we speak it, the accent we have, the food we like, the place we live, the work we do, all of it is conditioning acting itself out. It's memory that that is stored as language, as all the preferences that that are somehow acting itself out. And there is no problem with any of these as long as there is no identification with this conditioning as me. When there is a strong identification with conditioning, even a simple thing like a preference for food can create frustration when that food is not available, or a desire to run behind it. Whereas when the conditioning simply acts itself out, then it is not a problem at all levels. So when we recognize it, that conditioning is memory patterns and it is acting itself out at a transactional level in small and big ways, and it is a problem only when there is false identification with the conditioning as the me, as I. Then when I look at the question, how can I be free of conditioning, the very question is seen as another movement of thought, because every question is a movement out of silence. And this question is also a particular type of conditioning that recognizes the suffering, the sorrow created by conditioning itself, which is actually identification with conditioning, as we saw. And then the desire to be free of conditioning rises. And again, the I identifies with that desire, and therefore the role of a seeker, and says, how can I be free of conditioning? So the same identification comes back in this desire to be free of conditioning. Now, when we recognize all this is self-inquiry. This is a different way of asking the question, who am I? That was pointed to by Ramana Maharishi. And when we look into all of this, we notice that there is a silent recognition of all these movements. As we said, when there is a recognition that all conditioning is identification that causes suffering, and then the desire to be free of conditioning also creates another identification as a me, as an I. All of this is recognized in the light of awareness. There is an unconditional acceptance of all these movements, an unconditional awareness of all of this. And when we recognize this unconditional, total recognition of all these movements, that unconditional recognition is already free of conditioning. This is our very being. It is not then anymore a dry philosophy, but a direct glimpse into our very being as the silent recognition of all activities of the mind, of all identification, of all that was explored by both the identification with conditioning and the desire to be free from conditioning. All of this is recognized in a silent, unconditional space. And when we recognize this silent, unconditional space, we see that this is already entirely free. This is simply shining light on all these movements and remains completely untouched and ever pure. So, without looking for an answer to the question how to be free, which is a method or a practice or whatever, by simply inquiring into the question and into the questioner, which is false identification with the question, we directly come upon the ground of our being, a direct glimpse into our true being. This is the direct way of self-inquiry. And when we recognize this, then in that recognition, there is an expansion of the heart, there is a rest, there is peace, there is nothing that need to be understood there. There is simply a silent awareness that shines light on all this. So, this is our true being that always remains free of conditioning, but we, because of false identification, don't recognize our true being and get identified with conditioning. So this is the essence of self-inquiry itself, to recognize that our very being is free of conditioning and all questions are resolved in its source, not by acting on the question, not by finding an answer to the question, but by resolving it back into its very source. Now, one last question related to this that may rise is, yes, I taste this direct glimpse, the rest, the peace of being, but conditioning comes back. And here we have to recognize that this direct glimpse into our being, we somehow miss the sacredness of it, because it is not coming with some lights and some grand mystical experience of some kind. It is silent peace itself, and therefore we don't recognize the utter sacredness of this, and we slip back into conditioning when it rises again by false identification with it. So the answer lies in how we cherish the sacredness of this direct glimpse. It is not something that is to be taken lightly Everyone, in fact, glimpses this in different ways. A moment of complete silence, but we miss it because we don't see the sacredness of it. And even when we do self inquiry and, as we said, resolve back into the source of our being, we don't revere the sacredness of it. So therein lies the real reason why the next conditioning that rises, we go to identify with it. So instead, by grace, if we can recognize and revere the sacredness of the silence that comes through a recognition of all the conditioning and thought patterns, and also the tiresome nature of getting lost in conditioning, identifying with it, running behind things, and the utter futility of all of it. When we see that, then there is a natural love that comes out of the reverence for the sacredness of being, and a natural vigilance that comes out of the recognition of the tiresome, futile nature of running behind conditioning. So this is all the essence of self-inquiry, and how it is so important to do it with great reverence and love, and to also have the grace to be able to recognize, revere, and abide as our being. When Ramana Maharishi was once asked by a very illiterate woman, Desuramma her name, give me a mantra. I want a mantra to hold on to. And she was expecting some mantra that is given by most saints. But Ramana Maharishi, always giving the direct highest teaching, told her in Tamil, Unnai vidadu iru. That's the mantra. It means don't leave your being. So this is what we just spoke about. So if that one mantra that Ramana Maharishi gave, if we can hold on to this mantra by grace, through love and reverence for our being, then we abide in the ground of our being that is ever free of conditioning.